Hi, let's get started, and anybody who joins later can follow along. I'm Valerie Strauss. I'm a longtime education reporter at the Washington Post, and I'm delighted to be here tonight with Howard Gardner and Andy Hargreaves to talk about their wonderful new memoirs. We have Andy's, which is Moving, a memoir of education and social mobility, and we have Howard's, A Synthesizing Mind, a memoir from the father of multiple intelligences theory. First, I'd like to acknowledge Stanton Wortham, Dean of the Lynch School of Education and Human Development. Without him, none of us would be here today, and he is our host tonight. So, sir, wherever you are, thank you. Now, Andy and Howard. I'm not going to waste time introducing you. Everybody knows who you are. I don't need to read your resume highlights. Everybody knows you are two of the most influential thinkers in the world in education and in psychology in Howard's case. What people out there might not know is that despite very different upbringings, you have a whole lot of things that are in common. And that becomes apparent in your memoirs. The beauty of these books is that they tell stories not just of single lives, but both authors manage to wrap their lives around much bigger issues that affect everybody. Learning, thinking, intelligence, schools, class, just simply being. Howard was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania to German immigrants who fled Germany before World War II. Andy was born into a tight-knit working class family in Northwest England and raised in a home with no indoor plumbing. As I said, neither of them come from privilege, and both are first-generation college graduates. Both found their way into higher education, but both have felt like outsiders there. As Andy wrote, living in two worlds, which he'll talk about later, I hope. Both dislike the pretense that permeates the academic world. What's more, both have wide-ranging interests and refuse, as Howard wrote, to be categorized by a single discipline. Both have benefited from social mobility, which is what Andy writes a lot about, and synthesizing minds, which is what Howard writes about. So let's get started. Before we talk about your upbringings, I would like you both first to talk a little bit about why in 2020 you both decided to write your memoirs. What idea were you trying to get out into the world that goes beyond what your work has already put there? Let's start with Andy, who was the education chairman of the Lynch School.
Hi, thank you, Valerie. In deference to anybody who's been chair of the Lynch School, I just want to clarify, I've never been chair of the Lynch School, and that will
I meant the education department.
Or of the education departments, and that may be.
Is that right?
That may be a great relief to many of my colleagues.
Okay, well that's what, okay.
But I did hold an endowed chair, the Brennan Chair, in one of our several endowed chairs that we have, the Brennan Chair in Education, which had a mission of connecting theory and practice and promoting social justice, which is really what attracted me to the position. So to talk a bit, I'll just get it started, try not to take too long to begin with, because I'm so much looking forward to listening to Howard, actually, and thrilled to be on the stage with the most cited psychologist of education in the world, according to Google Scholar, and one of the most cited psychologists, period, in the world. So I think lots of people want to hear about Howard and hear about Scranton and hear if he ever met Joe Biden and all those things, or people who knew Joe Biden and those other things. I grew up in the northwest of England. It had all the characteristics that you described, Valerie. I didn't regard it as at all extraordinary at the time. You're in what you're in, and you are what you are, and you make the best of what you've got. It's only with hindsight that you realize my life was perhaps a bit more remarkable than I thought it was, and indeed millions of people have lives that are more remarkable than they think they are in retrospect. So my memoir, in a way, although it's a memoir of social mobility, isn't in a way like J.D. Vance's or Tara Westover's, which are people who heroically survived extraordinary chaos in their own upbringings, and were proud to go on to Yale and to Cambridge and so on afterwards. These are classic American dream stories, classic studies of success against all the odds. Mine is different. It's really a narrative of the many rather than a narrative of the few. And when I went to school as with people in my community, the education was very good. It was a solid primary education. England was in the height of educational progressivism in the 1950s and 1960s. Unlike America, progressivism really took off on a national level, a child-centered education, a whole child education, as we call it now. And not just my memories, but the inspector's reports of the school at the time say the same thing. It was focused on projects, on interdisciplinary learning, on connecting writing to creativity, connecting it to nature and the natural environment, alongside remembering your multiplication tables and having to be able to form your letters properly in that kind of balanced way that many of us in this profession advocate for, and as John Dewey did, but we often don't find that we get. And it was really only when I went to high school, which was a selective school for the top 15 or 20% or so at that time, if you passed the test at 11, that I began to realize some of the things that I was up against. Both my brothers didn't pass the test at 11. One because he walked out to the test in disgust because he was accused of cheating, because he wanted to borrow somebody's eraser, and condemned him for the rest of his life, actually, to a very different life than the kind of life I've had. So one of the first things we need to consider about social mobility is actually social immobility for those who didn't have the opportunity and the chances.
We can talk about social mobility in a little while. Real quick, why did you write this book?
Why did I write this book? Because if there was a defining moment, I mean, like Ernest Hemingway describes one of his characters and how he experienced bankruptcy. He said, well, I experienced bankruptcy gradually and then all of a sudden. And really, this is what this memoir felt like. It came upon me gradually and then all of a sudden. And the all of a sudden moment was about 7 years ago now. My mum was 93. She'd been a working class mother, woman all her life, lived in the same small mill town apart from a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
She'd worked 3 jobs while she was raising us. She was an essential worker. She worked in cleaning, working in local stores, looking after people's children, did all that. For a time was on welfare, on social security after my dad died, and she couldn't cope eventually. And so she was all these things all through her life. And then at the age of 93, she was really in her last days, and I sat beside her bed and for days. And at the beginning of it, I thought, well, what can I do? And I thought, well, I need to write something. I need to write something about. So it really began with writing about her and her life. And I sent it off to the local newspaper, and they decided to publish it as a double-page spread. So I was able to say to my mum, while she'd been unconscious for 9 days, taking no fluid or food, that I'd written something about her. I didn't think she could hear, but as I read out the first words, a single tear came down from her eye, just down her cheek. And
that's, I think, lovely, Andy. That's lovely.
At exactly that moment,
yeah,
I knew really that people like me were worth writing about, and that's really when it started.
Howard, how did your book come about?
First of all, let me thank you, Valerie, for that nice introduction, and Andy, who had the idea of doing this joint book talk, and Stanton for making it possible, because I'm happy to be here this evening. I was looking back at my work on intelligence and also on my books about the mind, because I've written lots of books with the word mind in it. And I realized that I was always writing about other people's minds, and I hadn't really stepped back and said, you know, what's my mind like? How does it work? And as you said in the introduction, you know, I've always felt a bit like a fish out of water. I didn't fit into any particular categories, though I guess, you know, from the outside it looked like I was doing fine. And I had realized a long time ago that I was good at synthesizing, but I'd never really tried to understand what's involved in being a good synthesizer. A synthesizer means you take material from all sorts of different categories, issues, sources, questions, and you mull it over and over again and reorganize it and try it out on other people. And eventually you put it out. I mean, I put it out in book form, but synthesizing is things that business people do, lawyers do it, doctors do it. And there were two things that I put together. One is something I heard from Murray Gell-Mann, who was a great physicist. He said in the 21st century, the most important mind will be the synthesizing mind. And I said, dude, that sounds pretty good to me. And then the other thing I realized is that my trade, psychology, as you mentioned, doesn't have much to say about synthesizing. And I think I know why. To get tenure in a psychology department, you have to do experiments. And there are things you have to be able to do quickly in the laboratory. And I'm a book person. I think Andy may be a book person too. That's different from people who are article people. And books take a long time. If you want to understand what it takes to write a book, you can't simulate it in the lab. So the book does three things. Number one, it talks a bit about my life, including the fact, as you alluded to, that I'm 77 years old and come from Scranton, and somebody else has the same descriptor. He's about to become president. So there's some stuff about me, and we can talk about that. Second of all, I do talk about not only how I came up with the idea of intelligences, but also what happened with the idea, because many things that happened I didn't like at all, though it got me interesting invitations and trips and stuff like that. But for me, the heart of the book and the new material is an effort to begin to explain what synthesizing is well enough so that teachers and individuals who have to teach themselves, now of course you can do it online, can become better synthesizers, because I think that's the last thing that's going to be replaced by artificial intelligence. So that's, in a nutshell, what's behind a synthesizing mind.
Well, it's interesting that both of you write in different ways about synthesizing and the fact that there's so much rigidity in curriculum in K-12, Andy writes, and in higher ed. You write, Howard, you write about the reluctance to blur the boundaries of different disciplines. And so could you talk a little bit about the Department of Social Relations, and what that was, and how that kind of became the intellectual grounding for most of your work? When I saw the title, Department of Social Relations, I had no idea what that was.
Or you had the wrong idea, which would be, yeah, I was fortunate enough to go to Harvard College, and I started out as a history major, and I'm actually very much a historian in spirit, but I didn't like my tutorial, which was what you do when you're a sophomore. And then a tutor, a teacher, said to me, maybe you should look into SOCREL, which was the abbreviation for social relations. And in a nutshell, after the Second World War, when we thought we had won the war in part because we had lots of understanding of the enemy and we're good at propaganda analysis and at figuring out codes and things like that, that maybe we should put together the social sciences, as they're called, psychology, sociology, and anthropology, which I think was a very good idea. I think social relations, SOCREL, was a terrible name. As you said, it indicates nothing. And by the time I became a student, it was already, I wouldn't say in extremis, but it wasn't what it had been in the 40s and 50s. And by the time I finished my doctoral studies, it was closed down. But the idea, Valerie, that understanding human affairs, which is what I'm interested in, human beings, human thinking, social relations, you really can't do it from single discipline. You can't just talk about the mind and the brain. You can't just talk about your relationship to other people near you. You can't just talk about different cultures because there are too many of them. So I got seduced by the idea that our understanding of human beings is much better if we try to combine those lenses. And it's interesting, the people who I have become closest to in 50 years since I finished my studies are people who are actually SOC-REL people, because they also don't think that a single discipline can get you the understanding that a combination of discipline can. Full stop. You can't put disciplines together unless you know something about them. And to try to jump into disciplinarity without knowing something about the disciplines is a bad idea. And my anxiety about young people growing up today, especially those who get their education mostly from the web, is it's a fantastic treasure trove of information, but you have no idea of how people came up with it, and you can put it together in ways which do not make any sense. So I've never said this before, but I think to be a good interdisciplinarian, you've got to be a bit of a disciplinarian in a couple of fields first, and then you can put them together.
Got it. Andy, I'd like you to talk a little bit more about this feeling of being an outsider, living in two worlds. It sounded like you wrote about it a lot in different stages of your life and how it affected you. And I'm wondering how it has affected your work, how it affects your ability to communicate with people on campus, off campus, and maybe whether true creativity comes out of some of the zeitgeist of feeling like you're not in one place, that you belong in one place, but that you have legs in different ones.
Well, in a way, I think I'm not so much outside as between two different places. And I think that affected me both consciously and subconsciously. So I lived on one side of town, went to school on the other. And as school went on, there were fewer and fewer people on my side of town compared to the others. So I had to manage one set of friends with one set of interests on one side of town, and another set of friends in another set of interests, different kinds of knowledge. I had to negotiate the local gangs, which you can read fairly graphically at a couple of points in the memoir. And so constantly in your life, and this is true of a lot of the literature on social mobility, you're trying to hold these two different things together somehow without you falling apart because they're pulling you in different directions. And in a conscious sense, where that led me eventually, really beginning in my 20s, when I started teaching, was really to advocate for the group that was really more oppressed, less privileged, more marginalized, people from my side of town, if you like. And that was at that time in England, it was in a social class sense. We can talk about class and race later on. Race really became more prominent through the 1970s in the UK. So it really began. It sparked or started my interest in social class inequality. The subconscious, much more subtle, and I only became really aware of this, I think I was probably in my 40s before I realized what was going on, because you stumble through careers very often rather than have a beautiful linear plan like you're supposed to have at promotion and tenure reviews. The subconscious part of it is my PhD dissertation was on middle schools. And so I studied middle schools, which contained ex-elementary school teachers and ex-high school teachers trying to create this thing called a middle school together, and largely failing, actually, at the time. And then I found with the interdisciplinarity that Howard described, I was in a department led by Zygmunt Bauman, one of the greatest living sociologists who died recently, which was very macro. But I was interested in classroom interaction, which was very micro. And so I had this micro and macro going on. So for a long time, I've been interested in big things and little things, and trying somehow to see the big stuff in the little stuff, and to see the little stuff in the big stuff. And all through my career, I found I've often been drawn to things that other people put together that I, in some ways, successfully or less successfully, disciplines, institutions, whatever it might be, that I'm trying to bring together rather than to pull apart.
Howard.
Yeah, actually, what Andy said triggered a line of thought in me, and I had never thought about this before. I've never really felt an outsider, and I think people who look at my life would say, well, you know, you're certainly not an outsider. But there's a difference between being an insider and feeling you have to do what pleases the rest of the in-group, and being lucky enough to be in a group, but saying what you think and being willing to remove yourself. I'll tell one example. I'm very non-political, and I'm actually don't like to get into arguments except about academic matters. But when we had a president at Harvard who I thought was really behaving inappropriately, I became a public critic of him, and I was the only person essentially who wasn't in the arts and sciences, but in a professional school, who became a critic. And a lot of people wouldn't speak to me afterwards. And I realized you pay a price when you say what you think, even though nobody's kicked you out officially. And so I mean, as you said, Valerie, I mean, children of immigrants, they didn't go to college. When I was young, my parents were very, you know, didn't have much money and so on. But maybe it's because I lived so much in my own mind. I didn't feel like an outsider, but I've never felt that I had to say what you need to say to be in the in-group. So it's a different kind of outsider-insider thing. I don't know, Andy, does that make sense to you?
It does. It's quite subtle once you get into it, because it does permeate your way of being in ways you're not fully conscious of. Clearly, as Howard just said, like at this moment, I just realized. And my son once said something to me when he's a professor now in Hong Kong. And he said, when he was a teenager, he said, I know what it is with you, Dad. Your problem is you're too intellectual for ordinary people, and you're too ordinary for intellectuals. And it was absolutely right in a way. I can go into a gathering, and there'll be potential donors of millions of dollars, and then there'll be somebody on the waiting staff. And you know, I was brought up that you talk to everybody in the same way. And so I would spend as long with a member of the waiting staff in the same way as I would as I would and do actually with potential donors. So it permeates in all kinds of ways, even right into our ways of being, I think.
I feel the same way. I owe that to my parents, who were incredibly non-status conscious.
Yeah.
And I'm constantly mystified when there are people who are only ranking you by how much money you have or how much power. You know, I like to rank people by whether they're decent people, and that's quite orthogonal to how much power or influence they have. I also like to give people the benefit of the doubt, which has sometimes hurt me, but I'd rather not be extraordinarily suspicious.
Yeah.
How did the two of you meet?
Oh my God!
On
That's
paper.
Yeah.
Probably through Posse, is that right?
Yeah, I think we met. I mean, I'm sure I'd come across you before, and of course I knew of you really, really well. But we first time we met properly, I think, was through. Well, you started, Howard, because you had the insight.
I think the first time that we spent some real time together was when a person whom we both esteem very much, and I know you know of him, Valerie Posse Salberg,
Yes.
began to visit Boston. and had written this book about Finland, which is a very important book, education. And Andy wrote the introduction, the foreword to the first edition of Finnish Lessons. Diane Ravitch, known to many people, wrote the foreword to the second. I wrote the foreword to the third. And then when Pasi began to teach here, we spent more time together. And we've been at different events together, but it probably within the last 10 years, not earlier. But what is I mean, this is a fun thing as you get old. People often have very different memories of how they first met.
Yeah, no, I was wondering if you saw each other out or you met at a conference or, you know, what the meeting of the minds was. I'd like to go back a little, Andy. I was really struck by your story of Miss Hindle. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, Mary Hindle.
Tell us about Miss Hindle and how that, I think she changed your life.
She did. So I was as a 10-year-old kid with a smart kid, bright kid, for reasons I'll never know, but curious, interested, bit difficult. In my 50s, I was diagnosed adult ADD, quite strong adult ADD, with many benefits and one or two dysfunctions. And of course, I had all these as a child. I stood by a desk one day, and she was writing a report on me, and I said, "What's highly strung mean?" And of course, she should never let me see that report, but that's the nearest they could get to ADD. So I was smart, but I kind of lose things. I constantly forget books and equipment, late for everything, get glue and paper all over me when we were doing arts and crafts. Often talked out of turn, talked too long. I'm doing now. You know, all those things. And I think what Miss Hindle did through the way she taught and the way she was, first of all of us, she involved us in these kind of creative, very engaged activities. She never used the blackboard, never used the blackboard, and was proud of that. And we got to stay in at recess to work on projects if we wanted to work on just ordinary working class kids. And but she also really knew me, knew who. She understood me. She got me in a way for all my strengths and weaknesses. She, in the Ken Robinson sense, she let me be who I was, but didn't let me be too much of it. So it didn't get in the way of, you know, anybody else being who they wanted to be at the same time. And so she was truly inspiring for me, and really was really the first person who thought, I'd like to do that. I could do that. What a great thing to be, and what a great thing to do. And many years later, I wrote back to her to thank her. Like I'd become a professor. I was getting on. I was doing quite well. And I'd written a book with my colleague and friend, Michael Fulham, a short book in big print. And so she was in her, like, well into her 70s then. And so I thought she'd appreciate that. So I sent it to her. And I said, you probably don't remember me, but, you know, I was in your class and very inspired by you, went into teaching and then into teacher education. And a lot's happened since then. And this book has sold over 100,000 copies. And it's about teachers and the value and the importance of teachers. And then she wrote back in a beautifully handwritten thing. And she said, actually, I do remember you. Are you the boy, and I'm incriminating myself here. She said, are you the boy who did that magnificent Spanish dancing? Because I used to like to dance flamenco, you know, with your hands behind your back and your feet stomping and making a bit of a noise. And so that's what she remembered about me, even though I remembered so much about her. And then would you like me to tell the last bit? Because
yes.
When I was a child, one of the things I got into trouble for quite a few things, was I was the bell monitor to ring the bell at recess. And one day I rang it just, you know, I thought it was time. So I rang it, and then everybody went out to school, but they weren't supposed to, because there was like some meeting or the school nurse was coming in. So chaos and havoc reigned, and they spent a week trying to get me to apologize. They brought in my parents, they put me in detention, they did, and I wouldn't apologize at the end. And then some years ago, the school, my old school, was putting up a new building, and it was a wonderful thing. They asked me back to lay the foundation stone of the new building. So I said, I'll do that if I can do that with my best teacher, Mary Hindle. So she came along with Miss Sutcliffe from the class next door. They had a house together on the other side of town. And what a wonderful thing that might have been if we'd have known about it at the time. And so when you walk into the school now, there are two great things. One is it says that this foundation stone was laid by former pupil Professor Andy Hargreaves and his teacher Mary Hindle. And they gave me a gift, which was the bell. And they said, now you can ring this bell anywhere, anytime, for any reason of your choosing. So I owe a lot to her. She lived into her 90s, and outstanding educator, really.
That's a great story. Howard?
Valerie, I don't know whether you remember from my book, but I talk about a 6th grade teacher, Miss Dyer. Yes.
My next question. That was my next. I was going right there.
Okay. Well, I actually, from a very young age, I kind of assumed that I would be a teacher because I like to teach people, and I was probably somewhat bossy. But in 6th grade, there was a teacher whom I didn't like very much, and her brother was a superintendent of schools. I don't think that was terribly important to me, but it was something that we all knew. And one day she said something, she identified a note. And I said, no, it's a different note, a musical note. And she came and she paddled me quite hard on my hand. And this was not something that one did in Scranton in the middle 1950s. And I went home and told my parents. And my mother was a German Jew who had escaped with her life and spoke with a thick accent. And she took me by the hand and she marched to school, to my school, James Madison School on Quincy Avenue, and into the principal's office and explained what happened. I remember his name was W. Archibald Reese, and he called Miss Dyer in and he had her apologize to me. And I was astounded because adults didn't apologize to kids. The sister of the superintendent certainly didn't. And my mother, we were very afraid, that people thought we were Nazis because we had a German accent. But it gave me ideas about justice and about speaking up, which was a tremendous gift. Also, having thought a fair amount about Andy's book, we both read each other's books as they were in formation, as they were being formed. As I mentioned, my parents did not have a higher education for a number of reasons, but they did have a fair amount of what I would call cultural capital that is coming from Europe. They like to read. My mother liked music, and they talked about political and cultural issues, and I think that makes a big difference if you don't have a lot of financial capital or social capital. If at least there are people around who try to activate your mind. I talk a lot in the book about my Uncle Fritz, who did that. And I imagine this may have happened to Andy, it certainly happened to me. If you live in a city like Scranton, it's probably 100,000 people there, it's much smaller now. If you are a so-called bright kid, I was a good pianist, I did radio and television, other people try to help you along. They throw out a net, just like your teacher may have, and you don't appreciate it at the time, but it's a very old community kinds of things, whether you're in China or in a Jewish shtetl. If there's a kid growing up, likely it would have been a male until recently, you try to give that person a boost. And then when you get older, your job is to do the same thing. And I think that's one of the most important things we have to confront in the United States now. It's very difficult. It's much easier to give a boost to somebody in whom you see yourself physically and racially and demographically, but that's not what we need anymore. We need
Absolutely.
to see potential despite those superficial differences.
Right. Before we go, keep going, I'd like to just tell everybody who's watching that about 7 o'clock we will turn to questions. So please, put your questions in. We're getting some now, and we'd like to get as many as we can in. Thank you. So you're talking about social mobility, which is basically the theme of Andy's book. And I was curious. It seemed to me, Andy, you were writing about social mobility with the white working class.
Yeah.
And in this country, and in Britain too, actually, racism is a real impediment to that. But I'm wondering, as I was reading the book, do you think that the lack of social mobility is about class and not race, or is it a mix?
That's a profoundly important question as we move this concept backwards and forwards across the Atlantic. The concept of social mobility, of course, although it's probably bigger in the UK than it is here, was invented by an American. It was invented by Petrim Sorokin, who was a Russian exile who moved to Chicago and then founded the sociology department at Harvard University. So social mobility is an American idea. That the nearest thing to it in everyday language is probably the idea of the American dream, that anybody can make it despite their backgrounds or their handicaps or their obstacles. The way we think about race in the UK now, which of course is where I grew up until well into my 30s, is what's called BAME. So that's Black, Asian, and Minority English. And BAME has suffered as badly through coronavirus in the UK, for example, as African Americans have within the United States. But although we were one of the inventors of slavery, the British, to our historical shame, the race wasn't really very visible in the UK until the 1960s, when Caribbean populations started to move in, particularly into southern England, and then Southern Asian populations, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, began to move into the Midlands and the North. So as a child, everything, apart from a couple of restaurants, everything I saw was white. Everything I experienced, everything that everybody experienced was white. My community had great values, solidarity, hard work, being the same with everybody, speaking your mind. Still, nonetheless, then, even before race, had suspicion of outsiders. So we were in the North, we were very suspicious of people from the South, because people from the South were like emotionally repressed. They were all like Hugh Grant. They wanted to get the better of you, basically. That they didn't value a Northern accent. They're always trying to put you in your place, make fun of you. They still do. Northern accents are still very marginalized. So inequality in England played out very much through class, and race came a bit later. And it came about the time I started coming home from university, and I saw terrible racism in my community, in my family, in my neighbors, all in my family, not just some of them, all of them. And I had blazing rows and conflicts with them, and so on. So race did become a huge issue, and we've seen how it's played out particularly in Brexit and the election of another populist, Boris Johnson. Because of, and before that of Margaret Thatcher, actually. So race became very important in the UK as well as class. And so now race and class very much go together. If you're oppressed by class but not by race, you're still oppressed. If you're oppressed by race but not by class, you're still oppressed. If you're oppressed by race and class together, which is what Kimberly Crenshaw called intersectionality. If you have one thing compounded on another, class, race, a gender identity, you have these multiple sources of oppression to deal with. It's in a sense, you're right. It's both together that are worse. I think one of the problems in America now that we could go on to when we talk about the next Secretary of Education is that it's forgotten about class. It has other words for class. It calls the working class the middle class. It converts class to poverty, but not all the working class is in poverty. And therefore, lots of America have been lost to the democratic agenda. And what we need to understand now, to spin what you've been asking, is that now actually the working class isn't just or only or even mainly the white working class. Our essential workers are migrant farm laborers. Our essential workers are immigrant and African-American care home workers. Our working class comes from all kinds of backgrounds, and we need to think of not class against race, but we need to think of class and race together in a common struggle for the same goals of equity and inclusion.
I think that there is OECD data showing that in the industrialized countries, the population that is more steeped in poverty and has the hardest time getting out are African Americans in the United States.
Yeah.
Any population.
Yeah.
Which I think speaks to the deep strain of racism that's gone through the country. Howard, we haven't talked much about multiple intelligences. That was on purpose, but I would like to ask one question or two. One goes back to the synthesizing mind. What were you synthesizing, and how did you come up with it? And while you're talking about it, I'm interested in the use of the word intelligences. You write about that, about how it might have been that word that sparked all kinds of critique and nonsense.
Sure. I chose to study psychology, and I'm more of a psychologist than anything else. For quite a few years, I was working with children, normal and gifted kids, particularly with an interest in the arts. That's always been very important to me. But I was also working with brain damaged patients. And the most important thing in understanding the effects of brain damage is where the brain damage is. Is it left hemisphere, right hemisphere? Is it superficial or deep? Is it lower or higher in the brain, and so on? And in working with these different populations, kids and brain damaged patients, it was clear to me that if you knew that somebody was good or bad in one area, you really couldn't predict whether they would be good and bad in other areas. If you know somebody is very good with language, you can't really predict whether they're musical. If you know if somebody is good in understanding other people, you have no idea whether they're also good in playing sports. So I developed the intuition that the intelligence was much more pluralistic than the word suggests. Also, as I describe in the memoir, when I was 13, my parents had a kid who would have been called bright. They didn't know what to do with him, so they spent a week and several $100s, which would be like tens of thousands of dollars, to have me tested now to conclude I probably would be best off being a clerk, which made me kind of dismiss all of these intelligence tests as being kind of stupid. Anyway, then in the late 70s, a Dutch foundation gave a lot of money to the Harvard School of Education, where I was not a professor, I was a researcher, to describe what we know about the nature of human potential. I always say it's a West Coast question rather than East Coast question. But I was given a big budget and a staff and 5 years to collate all the information we know about humans' cognitive potential. That was the important. And so I decided, look, Howard, you know about kids, you know about the brain damage, you know about the arts. I also had a travel budget. I traveled all over the world, learned about different cultures and so on. And then I had the job of putting it all together. And even though I had wonderful colleagues and I could test what I was coming up with and write little articles, in the end, it was a solitary process of talking to myself, creating matrices and grids and formulas and equations and metaphors, and trying to make sense of this huge amount of information from biology, genetics, anthropology, psychology, you name it. And I was doing a giant work of synthesis, though I don't think I used the word particularly at that time. Finally, all good things come to the end. The grant died and I had to write a book. And the book is called Frames of Mind. I do not know, and you'll probably never know, when I decided to pluralize the word intelligence. Because even though it's strictly a semantic choice, it made a huge difference. If I'd written a book called 7 Talents, I probably wouldn't be on Zoom tonight. But I took something which was very sacred to psychologists, because the biggest achievements of the 20th century from psychology were intelligence and advertising. That's really what changed the influence of psychology. And I was picking a fight without realizing it. When I criticized Harvard Press, I knew exactly what I was doing. I didn't realize that by using the word intelligence, I was basically, I won't use a, I was making trouble across the psychological firmament. And psychologists, they mention me in textbooks because it'd look bad if they didn't, but the psychometric, the psychology measurement community has never really bought the theory. But as you know, Valerie, because we've worked together for many years, it's had an enormous influence in education, in business, in anything where people try to get a 360-degree view of human beings. My own frustration is twofold. One, a lot of the stuff that people have done with it, I haven't liked very much. The other thing is most people who write to me today still think that I'm working on this. And in fact, I've had many other lives since. And that's the end in the, for those people who want to know the other things I've worked on, that's also discussed in the memoir, because whether I was studying creativity or leadership, or most recently higher education, I've always tried to synthesize stuff. And with a synthesis, sometimes it's ignored, sometimes it's ordinary, sometimes it's wrong. But a word I use frequently in the book, sometimes it changes the conversation. And what pluralizing intelligences did, and Dan Goleman gets at least as much credit for emotional intelligence, it changed the conversation about intelligence. By the way, this is for extra credit, and I think Andy knows about this. In Michael Sandel's book about meritocracy, he points out that Barack Obama used the word smart 900 times when he was president. And he was a real IQ junkie, though he probably never used the word. And that's not good for our society. I think this is where Andy and I are very much on the same page. We need to recognize not are you good in school, or can you, do a policy paper, what kind of a human being you are.
Can I, Valerie, reflect,
Sure.
reflect on that just one to another? It's like three quick comments, really. One is what you've just described actually as an example of outstanding creativity, which is you take an idea that for many people is their biggest problem and turn it on its head and turn it into the biggest opportunity. And that was a stroke of genius. Second, I'm not handicapped in the way you are by having one completely world-class lasting idea that everybody knows. So you're condemned for the rest of your life to suffer in a way that I never will. And there is a criticism of multiple intelligence theory from some of my colleagues in my field, and it is well, along with Ken Robinson's ideas about creativity, it's an interesting idea, but it's never affected a lot of people. And the argument that people use is that no government has ever adopted it. Frankly, if any government adopted one of my ideas, I'd be seriously suspicious about the idea. But I can go into almost any country anywhere and talk not only just to people in schools, and they will know about multiple intelligences. They'll have some grasp of what it is, and its influence attends hundreds of thousands of schools all over the world. And true, and thank God for that.
Very kind, thank you. Very kind, thank you.
And it's absolutely true. Are we breaking up? You can hear me?
We were, but you're okay now.
Okay, good. All right, excellent. All right, we were talking, you mentioned government, so let's take a quick look at what's happening today in ours. I am curious if you have any thoughts, A, about who you think a good education secretary would be for Joe Biden, and B, if he chose you and you could do what you wanted, what would that be? Who wants to go first?
Howard wants to go first.
Well, we talked.
Go on, Howard, you go first.
We talked a bit before about this, and actually Valerie knows much more about governance of education in America than I do, so I'll be succinct. I'm not certain that having a Secretary of Education in a country which is so decentralized as the United States is a good idea. Certainly there should be an Office of Education, and if it has assets, the better. But if I look at the influences of Secretary of Education over the years, I'm not very impressed. If I were, if my fellow Scrantonian were to consult with me, there's no, I would not consider taking it. But I would say it really needs to be a bully pulpit, which means that the most you can do is perhaps try to influence the conversation. And I wouldn't have said this 20 years ago, but I would have said 10 years ago. If we don't have an understanding of how truth is established and how it's disestablished, and if we don't have some understanding of what democracy is and what it isn't, we may as well close up shop in the United States. So if I were the secretary, that's what I would tour the country doing, and I would try to engage in respectful debate to people who prefer illiberal democracies, the phrase that's used in Hungary and Poland and is beginning to creep in here, and people who believe in fake news and alternative news and so on. And if I could move the needle a bit on those things, I think it'd be much more important than deciding, what kind of codes we should have about dress or sexuality or things like that. But now you know why I will never be a politician. Andy, what would you do? You're much closer because you spend a lot of time in the political realm.
Andy, before you start, I'd like your opinion on the idea that we don't need an education department. You've worked with ministries of education in many other countries, and I'm curious about what you think about Howard's idea. There are a lot of people question whether we need an education department.
Yeah, just one clarity. Obviously, you need to have an Office of Education.
Yeah, I get that. You're right.
In the 60s, and people, as I mentioned, like Frank Keppel and Doc Howe, did amazing things. But giving Shirley DeVos all this attention and a chance to just destroy things, and the next person has to pick up the pieces. It's like if we had one law about abortion everywhere. Anyway. Sorry, go ahead.
The interesting thing is she did what you were talking about, which is use it as a bully pulpit, but she was trying to talk about why her emphasis was about alternatives to public schools, because her main idea is, which she had said in 2015, that public schools are quote unquote a dead end. She's had antipathy for it for decades, so you would be a very different message coming from that office.
But she also introduced policies.
She did through regulation, which a lot of those Biden's going to reverse. Andy.
Look, you could put a blind person on a galloping horse in the Department of Education and it would do a better job than Betsy DeVos. So I'll just get that off my chest to begin with. Of course, Canada, which is, I've come back to live in Canada now and to work in Canada because this is where most of our grandchildren are. And there comes a point in life when that becomes the driving force, really. And we have no federal Department of Education at all. Each of the 10 provinces, which are vary in size, just like US states do. Each of the 10 provinces has complete autonomy over K to 12. There's some coordination across them. And we are the highest performing English and French speaking system in the world, apart from the city-state of Singapore. So empirically, rather than ideologically, Howard's answer is possible, is what I would say. So it is possible. If you have a federal Department of Education of some kind, what is its job? It is to use its money well. It is to establish a vision and a direction, say this is the way we're going, hammer the message home endlessly. give as much autonomy to people as possible, but then compel them to collaborate if they want the funds that are coming towards them. And there are all kinds of ways that we can incentivize that and make it possible across districts, across states, across rich communities, poor communities. So that's the first. Do you want me to respond to the rest of the question that Howard responded to? So
Yes.
I back Howard up completely on SOC-REL. So what Howard wants to do is to bring SOC-REL back into our schools. And I think about the past, ever since A Nation at Risk, we have suffered the consequences of being driven by testing, accountability, maths, literacy, and STEM. And social studies has been moved increasingly to the sidelines as a subject, as a discipline, as a focus, and actually even social studies itself has become less critical and more factual. And so the country that America is now is in some ways the country it deserves to be in education because of what we've given up and pursued instead. And Democrats and Republicans both have a lot to answer for in that sense. So bringing back democracy and social relations and debate and thinking for yourself and looking at different opinions and developing empathy, these are absolutely central priorities. And one place we really need to put that, which will be just a hard ask for Democrats, is in places where people don't agree with us always. I'm using the us, so it's a bit of a giveaway, with people who think differently, with people who vote differently. A lot of poverty in America is rural poverty. A lot of that poverty is in red states and not blue states, although it's in all states to some degree. That poverty is often white, but not always. It is Native American. It is immigrant American. It is migrant labor American. It is in the deep South. It's a lot of what African American poverty looks like. And I think for a long time, all the money and the resources, and frankly, the time of university faculty have gone into urban inequity and urban poverty and urban problems, and have sometimes tried to transplant those into rural communities. So I've worked with my colleague Dennis Shirley, who may be on here, for 7 years in the Pacific Northwest in 5 states, and with schools in those states and teachers, and schools in poverty, schools that are isolated from each other. And we have, and I looked up for the districts we work with, the voting records for 2016. And they were at least 50-50, and many were 2-1 for Donald Trump. And quite a few of the teachers we work with, and principals and superintendents, were Donald Trump supporters for all kinds of reasons. 30% of teachers, at least, voted Republican in the last election. They're not bad people because they voted Republican. But we have not come across a single teacher or a single school that didn't care passionately about all its students, creating equity, opportunity for them, dealing with diversity, bringing them together. So a huge challenge for the next Secretary of Education is to get out into the red states as well as the blue states, the rural areas as well as the urban areas, of all races and backgrounds, to work with people they don't agree with on other issues, as well as people they do agree with, and find a common cause drive movement for increased equity, inclusion, opportunity for all students, families and communities, wherever they are. And I would make that an absolute top priority as a way to drive equity that has been, I think, systemically neglected.
That takes us into our question and answer period. And here's a question that leads right into what you just said leads right into this question. It says, thank you, Dr. Gardner and Dr. Hargreaves, for your inspiring and informative talk. You talked about social justice and social mobility. May I ask how you describe the role of school to promote social mobility? Thank you. Adding to that, I wonder often if we ask schools to be the vehicles for too many things. And one of the things I wonder about that speaks to what you talked about and this question is how much influence does school really have on fundamental values of people? You know, people learn, they can learn science and then they grow up and they don't believe it. They can learn about the three branches of government and then they forget them. So getting back to this question, how do you describe the role of school to promote social mobility? And can schools really have an important role in that without the rest of society focusing in on it as well? Anybody?
So I said this before we started. If you were to write an op-ed on this tomorrow for the Washington answer sheet, which of course is completely within your power to do, how would you answer your own question?
Well, I would say no. I would say that the research shows that schools have a maybe 20%, if that much, influence on these kinds of things, and that people are more affected by their family and their church, their peers, and maybe social media now.
Social media. As Andy was talking, you know, I'm going to be blunt and politically correct. I would endorse the program that he described in rural accounts if we were able to shut off Fox News and minimize social media to friendships and things and not political. Because, and this may be a dividing line, I'm much more, I think, on Valerie's side. I think that, of course, in all of education, we should do what we can. And if we have great role models and wonderful teaching, of course, that's better than the alternative. But I think what's happened all over the world, but particularly in the United States in the last decades, and it is because of the fragmentation of media and news stories and the fact that most people, especially young people, get all of their news from social media. It's just incredibly difficult to overcome this. And when Donald Trump came into office, Steve Bannon said, I want to see if I remember this correctly, first we take on religion, which meant Islam, then we take on the coasts, which meant New England and New York and California, and then we take on higher education. Because as you all know, everybody listening here knows, higher education is the single biggest predictor of whether people go for Fox News or whether they at least look at some other kinds of outlets. So, so Andy, I think it's do what we can for every part in the country, but I think there has to be a respect for truth and how it's arrived at. Otherwise, it's going to be overwhelmed because, you know, Trump, somebody said wonderful, Trump is a poor person's view of what a rich person is, but he's also the autocrat for people who feel inadequate.
Well, first of all, Howard, you've made me think of two great words in the English language. One is the word eponymous, and I wish you'd written about the eponymous Mrs. Dyer. Because that would have been a nice way to describe it. And the other word you make me think of is oxymoron. And, you know, oxymoron is like jumbo shrimp and baby grand. Fox News is a great oxymoron, I think. To kind of amplify your question, many people have written, of course, about the collapse of public education over the last 2 or 3 decades, the separation of communities, the loss of funding. Bob Putnam has written about this, of course, in Our Kids. But the truth is there's been a collapse of everything, a collapse of public everything. And so why I did well, and possibly I suspect why Howard did well, is, you know, not just because of what we had as individuals, but we had a good public education system. I grew up part of the time in public housing, social housing. When my mother fell ill and couldn't get out of the house for 2 years, we were supported by public welfare, not as hopeless, hapless cases. When my high school teachers weren't teaching me very well, I was able to go to the public library and teach myself the things that they couldn't afford any books, but teach myself the things that they couldn't teach me. When I went to university, I got a full 100% public grant and had no burden of debt behind me. So what we've lost, I think, is, and we need in some way to think about getting back in all kinds of ways, like funding for college and restoring our public schools, is it's not just about that 20%, but the thing that enabled people like me and probably Howard to benefit from that 20% was the kind of public hope, the holding of us, the protection of us in all of the spheres of our life, as well as just when we went to school and back. And that's really what we have to think about as a society right now.
In this country, there are, you talk about the collapse of the public education system, but actually in some places the public education system is fabulous for some kids, and it's awful for other kids, and that remains the problem. I mean, you can find schools that are just as good as any schools in the world in this country, and the divide keeps growing and growing, and that kind of brings us to the pandemic. So we have a couple questions on that. And one of them, thank you both for being here. I'm curious if you have an opinion on the lasting effects of the pandemic and remote learning on students. One thing, so that's the question. One thing we do know is that the gaps between the haves and the kids who don't have much is growing. And the pandemic has served to underscore what we've already known, which is about the deep inequities in our country and in our system. So I don't know if either of you have given much thought to where this goes. More and more I hear as I report with students, teachers, superintendents, education chiefs of states, nobody really thinks we're going back to the way it was exactly before the pandemic, because we can't. The question is, what's going to evolve? What are some of the temporary changes that are being made now out of necessity are going to hold over? So what do you think, how do you think all of this might affect what comes? Anybody?
Well, shall I start, Howard? Because we've just set up a center that's dealing with this. So I'll try and make a quick start. We've set up a center at the University of Ottawa called Shaneen, Change, Engagement and Innovation in Education. It's worldwideweb.shaneen.ca. I have some wonderful colleagues with me, including Joel Westheimer, son of Dr. Ruth Westheimer, so who's written a lot about education and democracy. And we have a 10-point charter, and I'll just mention 4 things from that charter. One is don't imagine for a second that don't agree with Bill Gates or Governor Cuomo that digital learning is going to make teaching irrelevant and we can learn anytime, anywhere, any place. That's a delusion and a fantasy. One thing we've realized is how important physical schools are as places to go so kids' parents can go to work, as places where people can go and meet their friends, develop an identity, and as places where people are taught and cared for by certified professionals. So I'd say that's the first thing. Second thing is the country that, one of the countries that responded most effectively to the pandemic in education is Estonia. Estonia is also now one of the highest performing countries on PISA. And Estonia made internet access a human right in 2001. So it is public, it is universal, it is free to anybody who needs it within Estonia. So we need to think of internet access and devices for learning as being like water or anything else as a public service. Third, and I'll stop with this, is actually third, we need to think, well, third and fourth. Third is, what is the unique value proposition of technology? So when we go back, don't just throw iPads or Chromebooks or anything else into schools and hope for the best, which I know many places in America have done, because I've seen it and I've been on calls about it. But work out what the unique value proposition is, as business says, of what can technology do better than we can do in other ways. Connecting rural schools is one, helping students with special needs in another. In the future, I think completely transforming how we think about assessment is a third. And last, for everybody, including tech companies, take responsibility for risks as well as for benefits. So actually have a policy about risks, about digital addiction, online bullying, excessive screen time, address that as a school and as a district, address that as a tech company, and have a very focused and deliberate policy. And of course, last but not least is all tech companies should pay their fair corporate taxes. And we should be totally uncompromising about that because they make money off people's learning.
Howard, somebody asked a question that flows into this. How might the pandemic provide an opportunity to implement MI theory in ways that make sense? One of the things that we have seen come from reporting about the pandemic is that the need for mental health, for fostering mental health in kids, for fostering the arts in kids, for fostering all kinds of things, that schools that have been focused on math and reading test scores for 10 years, 20 years, it's become very apparent. Do you think that there's any chance that, well, yeah.
Okay, well, let me give a brief answer to that question, but also a brief answer to the earlier question. I'm a pessimist about almost everything, but I do believe that if we get through the winter and we have a vaccine, that people are not going to be permanently held back in their development because they've lost a year. But I think the one insight I have, or at least the one idea I have about the pandemic, is it's giving every profession and every institution, a lot of professions, a lot of institutions, the opportunity, if they want to take it, to figure out what's truly fundamental to what we do and what's kind of a bonus. Now, whether the professions and institutions decide to use that opportunity, nobody can say, but it's a wake-up call, which if used well, just one example everybody knows about, I happen to love going to work and being with other people, but there are lots of professions where that's not necessary. And maybe the pandemic is pushing us toward that realization. On the question of multiple intelligences in the pandemic, I don't think that the pandemic per se has much influence on how people think about MI issues, but the advent of technology, which is very versatile, means that we can present things in many more ways than we could have 50 years ago, and people can show what they know in many more ways than they did 50 years ago. And that actually does support the first point I made, namely, if we say, well, what's really fundamental in education? And one of the things we say is reaching every kid in a way that makes sense to them, that would be a bonus of the pandemic. But I just wanted to go away, and I want the government everywhere to figure out how to get ready for the next one. And I love what Andy said. Government should compel states to work together. Think about how much better we would have been in the pandemic if from January, all of the governmental federal monies would come only for states that would work together rather than causing the tremendously destructive every state and every governor on his own, her own, including Michigan.
Here's a question. Here's a fundamental question about education. Thank you both for sharing your thinking. In my view, we have lost the ability to reflect on what is probably the biggest question about education, which is, what is the purpose of education? How do we, leaders, teachers, policymakers, etc., re-engage with this discussion in a meaningful and transformative way? Now, in the United States, there's a huge clash about what the purpose of education is. You know, Republicans think it's to train the workforce, and Democrats largely have a broader view about training citizens and training well-rounded people to think. How do you address this question?
I think the first thing I would say is education is lifelong. it begins at least at infancy, if not before infancy. And here I am heading into my 9th decade or whatever.
Don't go too fast.
I hope I'm not.
You haven't peaked yet, Howard. You've got time.
just a broken record. But I think you're absolutely right, the questioner and Valerie. People have very different ideas of what education is for. And a lot of my work now is focused on that. But what I would say is education is fundamentally about possibility. I'm interested in the possibilities of what we can know and how the mind can work and how we can use what we know and how the mind works to do the best things we can for everybody else. But if you think it's only to get a job, we just finished a study, Valerie knows about this, largest study of higher education that I know of. And we asked 1,000 students and 1,000 other people, what's the purpose of education? And when people said, as half the people said, to get a job, and then we said, and what happens if after 3 years the job disappears? Most people had no answer at all. That's how stupid that answer is. And yet, as you said, and you blamed one party, but I'm sure you could find plenty of evidence in the Democrats to say the same thing. It's such a narrow, of course we want people to thrive, and thrive to be able to use your abilities in ways that are helpful to others and that put bread on your table. But if that's all it did, we would take kids at birth and just make them into apprentices as the way they did in the Dickens area, Charles Dickens, not Dick and Jane.
Which is, I mean, Andy's memoir talks a little bit about the sorting of kids in England, which in some countries they into the ones who get to go to college and the ones who have a trade.
Yeah, that's been a good thing about the United States. It's been a country of infinite second chances. But as Michael Sandel, who we talked about earlier, says, the second chances are unlikely to be had by many people. And I think that's a difference. You were asking about growing up in Scranton in the 50s. It was a depressed area. That was a technical term for a place which wasn't doing well financially. But I think most people felt that they could better their lot. And the reason we have such huge opiate deaths is because most people, male particular, white particular, think there's no particular hope for them. And if you don't think there's any hope, you're not going to be able to get better.
And Andy, anything on that?
Yeah, well, Boston College is hosting this, and it's a Jesuit university, and at Boston College, we introduce students when they arrive with, I don't know if we still do, but we used to do, with 3 questions. And the questions are, do you have a passion for something? Are you good at it, or can you become good at it? And probably Carol Dweck's not completely right. We can't all become good at everything. So that's a very important question. And third is, well, can that have benefits for other people? And if your answer to all these 3 questions is yes, you will experience absolute joy. And I think there's a lot to be said in that. Of course, that's harder to ask a 6-year-old than it is a 19-year-old. But there's people's sense of who they are and when they're going emerges. I think they're very important questions.
And alas, the role models we see in politics and the media are very difficult to undermine. And in our study of higher ed, I came to a conclusion, which I might not have without, is that schools do need missions, and religious missions can give a kind of stability and a sense of purpose, even to students who don't particularly belong to that faith. I mean, on almost any definition, Harvard is a great university. And yet when you ask people, what's the mission and what's the purpose, you get a mishmash answer. And I don't think that's good.
I'd like, before we finish, there's one subject that I've written a lot about over the years, and that's testing. Howard, you mentioned that you realized intelligence tests you threw your hand up, and I guess you thought they were worthless. And Andy writes about standardized testing a lot in his book, and how it sort of bastardized the education systems in a number of countries with an obsession with these tests. Can one of you talk to what kind of damage you think that the reform movement that made standardized, high stakes standardized testing, the central metric for measuring everything, how much damage has that done?
Well, I'll start off with a short answer, because in Ontario and Canada, we don't have high stakes tests, we have mid stakes tests. So we test in grades 3, 6, and 9. That is in literacy and math. The results are known, but they're not used explicitly to compare schools, and they're not used to punish principals or to close schools down or to set up charter schools alternatives. But even in Ontario, we've done research on this. We published this year, and what we found is almost all the negative consequences that you get in the United States: narrowing of the curriculum, teaching to the test, distraction from other things that are important, culturally biased test items, and actually avoidance of innovation in the years being tested, which was a really interesting thing we found. So you could innovate, an avoidance of innovation in the years before the year that was being tested. So very negative effects on innovation. And there's a process that we call racing cycles, which means schools went on 6-week cycles to look at spreadsheets, look at kind of proxies for the test results, find the gaps, plug the gaps, and so on. And these racing cycles were just catastrophic for any midterm or long-term thinking about anything, because everybody was thinking about the next 6 weeks, the next 6 weeks, the next 6 weeks. So even in Ontario, where the stakes are lower, these negative consequences are pervasive and pernicious, and even more so within the United States.
I would make a sharp distinction between testing and assessing. I think that in any realm of life, it's important and appropriate to know how you're doing and whether you can do better. And particularly what's called formative assessment, that's a technical term, to get feedback all the time. In a sense, it's easier in basketball because it's kind of hard to hide how well you're doing than it is in geometry. But if we were to focus on giving feedback to people and giving them scaffolding, which supports them, but removing the scaffolding, it would be much healthier. You asked us earlier, Valerie, how we met, and not you and I, how Andy and I met, and I said it was probably through Posse Salberg. And the three of us know he created this GERM, Global Education Reform Movement, which Anglo-American countries have led the way at. OECD, certainly an unindicted codes conspirator, which is to judge every enterprise by how it does on a certain kind of a test. And I wouldn't criticize places that do well, whether it's Singapore or Massachusetts. It's great if they do well, but if you lose, to go to the earlier question, if you lose track of why it is that we're trying to develop minds and to get them to use them well, and you substitute it, how do you do it on some kind of a metric? The end has completely disappeared, and it's all about means. One of the amazing things in this big study we did about higher education is when we ask students why are they seeking mental health, and they or their friends, why is this such a big problem? They talk about the stress. and they talk about the academic stress more than the social stress. And yet all the data we have is it's in colleges all over the country, people have been asked to do a fraction of what they were asked to do 20 years ago. But what these kids really mean is if I don't get a certain grade, I'm not going to get to do what I think I want to do, which is get that first job. And that's why I would like everybody to do public service for a few years rather than go from the high-stake high school to the high-stake college. I think it's disastrous for the kids and for the colleges and for the country. And this is why I'll never be made Secretary of Education anywhere. But the VC has given us the opportunity to say what we really think. And Valerie, you've been a very good extractor, at least of my views, I think of Andy's as well.
I just, before we wrap up, I could frankly sit here and talk to you guys all night. I'm having a ball, but we are going to have to stop in a few minutes. Do either of you have any question that you want to ask? Is there something in one of the memoirs that struck you as being really resonant with you? Is there anything you want to say to each other?
Well, I have a question for you, Andy. When I was trying to understand how I became a synthesizer, one of the things I came up with, and it's just a hypothesis, is I used to like to read encyclopedias. And I had no discipline at all because I didn't know what history was or what political science was or economics. And so in a sense, I was undisciplined but promiscuous. And I wondered whether that may be one of the things that set me off in being a synthesizer. And you're a synthesizer too. So did you do that kind of undisciplined reading as well? I mean, I used to go to the library in Scranton and just pick stuff up and read it. And
it's I think the first thing is I had a geography teacher, very inspiring geography teacher in high school, and she once gave me a feedback saying I'd invented a completely original classification for lakes, like glacial lakes, oxbow lakes. She didn't say whether it was a good one. She just said it was an original one. So from that moment, I thought, so I'm capable of inventing new things people may not have thought about before. So I'm curious. I'm interested in coming up with things that other people haven't already come up with, not for its own sake, but sometimes you see a gap and you think that there should be something about that, but there isn't. And when I began studying, I did my PhD in a sociology department because I was interested in classroom interaction. There's almost nothing on classroom interaction. So I read sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, ethnography, anthropology, almost anything I could. And I think throughout life, if I'm kind of curious about issues, and then I'll read anything that is relevant, including environmental science, and think, right, I need to get on top of that in order to understand this thing that I'm looking at. So I think that's what drives me. But then I have a question for you.
please.
So a very touching part of your childhood is the story that, if you don't mind me sharing this, but if you want people to buy your book, they're going to get it anyway. Is a very touching story that before you were born, you had an elder brother who was killed in a sledding accident. And there were two consequences of that. One was that your parents said, had they not have conceived you, you were not in the womb, they may well have committed suicide, which is extraordinary, really. And a huge thing to carry in some ways about the weight of somebody's expectation. And secondly, that they probably protected you quite, they wouldn't let you do, totally understandable, they wouldn't let you do physical activities and so on. And two people I greatly admire who've both passed away now, one is Ken Robinson, the other is Seymour Saracen. who set up the psychoeducational clinic at Yale. Both had polio when they were children and felt that the adversity of polio in an odd way and what it did, how it framed and shaped their childhood, was really a foundation for the kinds of thinkers and contributors that they became. So can you say a few words about whether this adversity, or what many people see as a negative thing, you know, being overprotected, having the burden of an elder brother who died, in what ways that became a positive thing in your life as well as a negative one?
Should I lie down on the couch? Let me say first, my parents did say that they would have committed suicide, but the context is they had lost everything. They grew up middle class in Germany. They arrived in the United States with 5 cents in their pocket, literally, on crystal night, the night of broken glass. And many of the relatives, you know, they didn't know where they were, they died and so on. So it wasn't only the loss of a child, but the loss of everything. What I say in the book is that there were 2 things they didn't talk about, and I kind of discovered myself. One was about the Holocaust, which incidentally, young people won't know this. This was not discussed in the United States till the 1960s. It's like it didn't happen. But they also didn't say what happened to my brother. There was just a photograph of him, and they said he was a kid in the neighborhood. And then I found some clippings, and of course I knew. So these were burdens which I wasn't conscious of, but by unconscious obviously was aware of both of those things. When I went to school, I spoke with a German accent because all I heard was people speaking German. I'm enough of a psychologist to say we don't have the control group. We don't know whether I would have been different if, you know, it'd been a family, the middle class, Joe Biden's family, and the brother lived. But I guess, you know, I think my cousin is listening, and my sister has read the memoir. I think there was a lot put on my shoulders. And I was lucky enough that it didn't defeat me. But, you know, when there are expectations in people and you have the same thing, you might let them down. And that is something. I was sick too as I was young, and I had lots of things physically wrong with me, but nothing at all like what Sir Ken had or Seymour. But here's a final thought. Memoirs are wonderful things to write. And one of the great things is when people knew you when they were young and they write you, say, I didn't see like this at all. Like my sister said, you weren't a replacement child. Well, I said, how do you know? That's how I felt. But they are about one person.
I've had that too. Yeah.
They're about one person, and you have to take that person's best efforts to construct it. And
I'm afraid we're going to have to close. You've got something else you want to say real quick?
Just one sentence. Yeah, that is one consequence of writing of my memoir is that my childhood sweetheart found it and wrote to me.
Oh, that's a great way to end.
It is.
That's a great way to end. And I know when when I ran an excerpt of his book on my Washington Post blog, somebody in Scranton got in touch with you who you hadn't seen in a long time too. That's wonderful. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Howard and Andy for doing this. It's been a ball. It's been informative. It's been illuminating. I just do want to say it's a good thing I didn't list your resumes, because the one point that I did, I got wrong. So it's a very good thing we went right into the discussion. And it's been an honor, gentlemen.
You were terrific. You've done so much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Valerie, for we know what an incredibly busy and demanding life you have, and we feel very honored, really, to have you facilitate this.
The honor's mine, and I urge everybody who's listening to go out and get the books. I didn't want to put them down. I really didn't. I found them completely engaging. And I don't find a lot of memoirs that way. So thank you. And till next time.